Let me tell you something, because history has a strange way of hiding its most powerful figures in plain sight, and Fatima bint Muhammad is one of those names that people mention softly but rarely stop to fully understand. And the more I studied her story, the more I realized that if history were honest, she wouldn't be a footnote. She would be a headline, because this woman wasn't just the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. She was a living embodiment of endurance, dignity, and moral strength in a time that tested the human soul in ways we can barely imagine. Now think about it. She grew up watching her father mocked, persecuted, humiliated, physically attacked for speaking truth. And instead of turning away, instead of choosing comfort, she stood closer. She defended him. She carried the weight of a mission. That was never meant to be easy, and she carried it quietly, without speeches, without armies, without applause. And that's what makes her story so unsettling for a modern world addicted to noise, because Fatima didn't shout, she endured. She didn't demand power. She represented it through patience, through restraint, through sacrifice. When her family faced hunger, she didn't complain when her home was empty. She didn't ask why when injustice surrounded her. She didn't lose herself to bitterness. She held on to principle and faith with a firmness that would break most people today. And what really struck me is how her strength wasn't aggressive. It was grounded. She didn't dominate others. She mastered herself, and that is a kind of power we rarely talk about anymore, because it doesn't fit neatly into a highlight reel. But if you look closely, her life reads like a masterclass in resilience. She lost her mother early. She endured exile. She lived through economic blockade. She buried her father and faced political turmoil that would shake any soul, and yet her moral compass never wavered. She spoke truth when it mattered. She defended justice when silence would have been safer. And she did it without abandoning grace. And here's the part that modern culture struggles with the most. Fatima didn't seek validation. She didn't measure her worth by influence or followers or material comfort. She measured it by responsibility, by loyalty, by integrity, by closeness to God. And that's radical today, because we live in a time where worth is loud, and she was quiet but unbreakable. And when people talk about legacy, they often talk about conquest or empire, but Fatima's legacy is conscience. It's the idea that righteousness doesn't need permission from power to exist, that truth doesn't need majority approval to be true, and that dignity doesn't depend on comfort. And maybe that's why her story feels untold, because it challenges us too much. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about what we value, what we chase, and what we're willing to sacrifice for convenience, because Fatima chose the harder path every time and never lost her humanity in the process. And when you step back and really absorb it, you realize this wasn't just a historical figure. This was a moral anchor for an entire community, a reminder that faith isn't inherited, it's lived, that honor isn't claimed, it's proven, and that strength doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it looks like perseverance in the face of loss. And if we're honest, maybe the reason her story isn't told loudly is because it exposes how shallow our definitions of success have become, because Fatima bint Muhammad didn't conquer lands. She conquered despair, and in a world drowning in noise, that kind of victory is the rarest of all. Let me continue, because the deeper you go into Fatima's story, the more uncomfortable it becomes for anyone who thinks strength only shows up when history is kind, because her life proves that real character is revealed when history is cruel. And what stays with me is how she lived at the intersection of private pain and public responsibility, where every loss she endured was personal, but every choice she made carried consequences far beyond herself. And that kind of pressure can crush people, yet she remained composed, grounded, deliberate, and deeply principled. And I keep thinking about how she navigated grief, because she didn't escape it. She didn't numb it. She didn't deny it. She carried it with awareness. And that's something modern culture avoids at all costs, because we're trained to run from discomfort. But Fatima leaned into responsibility, even when her heart was heavy. And that tells you something about her inner strength, because anyone can be strong when circumstances are favorable, but remaining upright when everything familiar is stripped away, that's rare. And what also struck me is how her sense of justice wasn't emotional or reactionary. It was rooted in clarity. She understood the difference between anger and principle, between and personal hurt and moral duty, and that distinction matters, because history is full of people who justified chaos in the name of righteousness, but she never crossed that line. She articulated truth without abandoning ethics, and she defended what she believed without surrendering her humanity. And that balance is incredibly difficult to maintain, especially in moments of upheaval and what makes her saint. Or even more relevant today is how she challenges the modern obsession with visibility, because she didn't live to be seen, she lived to be accountable. And that flips everything we're taught upside down, because now we equate impact with attention. But her impact came from consistency, from alignment between belief and action, from refusing to compromise values, even when compromise would have brought relief. And if you really think about it, her life forces a serious reckoning, because she reminds us that proximity to truth doesn't guarantee ease. It often guarantees hardship. And she accepted that without resentment. And there's something deeply unsettling about that level of acceptance, because it exposes how often we treat principles as negotiable when life gets inconvenient, and she refused to do hat. And maybe that's why her story resonates so strongly once you actually sit with it. Because it's not just historical, it's confrontational. It asks you what you stand for when no one is watching, what you protect when protection costs you something, and who you become when the world doesn't reward integrity. And Fatima's answer was always the same. She chose restraint over retaliation, responsibility, over resentment, faith, over fear, and dignity over despair. And in doing so, she left behind a legacy that doesn't age, because it's not tied to a moment. It's tied to human nature itself. And the uncomfortable truth is that stories like hers don't fade because they're irrelevant. They fade because they demand more from us than we're comfortable giving. And that might be the most untold part of all. And if I'm being honest, the third layer of her story is the one that lingers the longest, because it forces you to confront what happens after the dust settles, after the crowds move on, after the loud chapters of history are written, and what remains is the quiet weight of living with consequences. And Fatima lived in that space where ideals were no longer abstract. They were tested daily in how she spoke, how she remained silent, how she carried herself when recognition was absent and support was uncertain. And this is where her humanity becomes undeniable, because she wasn't immune to pain. She wasn't detached from the world. She felt deeply, she cared deeply, and yet she never allowed pain to turn into corrosion of character. And that's something most of us struggle with, because disappointment usually hardens people. It makes them cynical. It shrinks their generosity. It rewrites their intentions. But in her case, suffering refined her instead of deforming her. And that's a distinction worth sitting with, because it tells you that trials don't automatically elevate anyone. They reveal who you already are. And she revealed a soul anchored in purpose rather than outcome. And the more I reflect on that, the more I realize how revolutionary it is, especially now, because we live in a time obsessed with results, immediate, visible, measurable results. And Fatima's life rejects that obsession entirely, because much of what she didn't produce instant victories or applause or closure, yet it mattered profoundly. And maybe that's the hardest lesson to absorb, because it means doing the right thing without guarantees, without timelines, without assurance that anyone will ever acknowledge it. And she did that repeatedly. And what's striking is how she maintained balance. She didn't withdraw from the world, nor did she dissolve into it. She understood limits. She understood responsibility. She understood that moral clarity doesn't require cruelty, and firmness doesn't require harshness. And that combination is rare, because people tend to swing to extremes, either becoming passive in the name of peace or aggressive in the name of justice. But she walked a narrow path with discipline and awareness. And if you're paying attention, her story quietly dismantles the myth that influence must look dominant, because her influence was ethical. It shaped generations not through force, but through example. And that's unsettling for mode. RN narratives, because it suggests that the most transformative figures might never dominate headlines, and that makes us uncomfortable, because it challenges how we measure significance. And maybe that's why her life still echoes, because it refuses to be simplified. It can't be reduced to slogans or aesthetics or convenient interpretations. It demands contemplation. It demands humility. It demands that why you look inward and ask whether your values hold when circumstances turn against you, and whether your faith is conditional on comfort or rooted in conviction. And that's why the untold part of Fatima's story isn't just about what she endured. It's about what she refused to become. She refused to become bitter. She refused to become careless. She refused to become small, even when life pressed in from Eve. Right direction, and in a world that constantly rewards noise, her quiet strength stands as a reminder that the deepest impact often happens beyond visibility and that maybe the most powerful legacy isn't dominance or recognition, but the ability to remain whole when everything around you is fractured.